First of all, thanks to the organizers of the conference. This was a bold undertaking, and I think an important one. To me, a very inspiring part of a process of the global consideration of identity in the contemporary, social, political, and moral landscape. I see this as the beginning of a great age of global discussions. I think an enormous amount of the work that is done in identity is going to be done in local contexts. At least that's my sense of it. But it makes it all the more important to have conversations across local contexts in order to learn and grow and check one's own thoughts, realities, constructions within a context of other people that are struggling with this. And so these conference like this is, to me, a very important. Just in terms of a very brief introduction of myself, I became interested in the question of identity, well, growing up, of course, but became concerned with the question of group identity coming out of the student movement of the 1960s, the American version of it, as an undergraduate at Berkeley, and have been concerned really with the question of American identity ever since. Now, understanding that, posing that, I'm extremely aware that there's no American identity, that there are many identities of the Americas and certainly many identities of the United States, and many of those I won't talk about here, and I am simply an observer and an interested party in relation to. So these are not. I'm not talking in a global context about that, and I'm certainly not talking in a broader context about identity globally. I mean, I think to come to a conference like this is to be aware. For me, is to be aware. Someone who's really is, the worst of American provincialism in some way. To be aware of how many discourses there are around the world, of which I, again, only can be intrigued by and interested in and try to learn from. I've tried to broaden my own understanding of the relationship of American identity as I understand it and think about it to other discussions within the United States, but also globally. I've gone and talked and held conversations in a number of parts of the world. Again, out of my interest in conversation. I don't claim to know much about this, although I'm told by some people I know that I'm opinionated. But you will see if I should reveal that side of myself, you will see through it immediately. And so I welcome conversation and I welcome dialogue. A lot of the times, if I give presentations in other parts of the world, it is to be told what I'm missing. And so that's become a part of my persona by this point. So please, don't hesitate. I'm sure you won't. The title of what I'm going to say today is slightly reformed. I like the title, but I tried to also broaden it a little bit, given my own limitations, beyond the crisis of identity, toward a democratic selfhood and citizen. The contemporary age is an age filled with promise and fear. Identities once taken for granted are collapsing, leaving individuals caught between utopias of nowhere and an intractable present. Yet new identities are being generated in many places. While the young coming of age face a theater state of empty posturing and ritual, whose underlying tone is that of elegy, it is a time when ordinary citizens from around the globe can take part in their own historical self-defining. For we who seek to redeem those promises of identity, sensing that in crisis identity has become an open question, we wish to understand and converse together about the nature of that openness. How and why has all that is solid melted into air? What must be done to forge identities adequate to a rapidly shifting postmodern and global world? I hope in this essay first to provide some context for the contemporary crisis or some of its distinctive aspects, to suggest some ways of thinking about the project of reconstitution, and then to offer from my own U.S. perspective, a framework for at least one new pathway toward a vision of postmodern human identity and community. I do not claim that this diagnosis, the framework for an agenda, or the specific developmental model offered is the only viable approach. Indeed, I call upon and wish for and hope for psychocultural thinkers and actors to imagine, theorize, and actualize new syntheses of cultural ideals and human identity. What I hope above all to leave is the conviction that beneath the present cynicism and irony, this is a time of testing, of experimentation, a time when new cultural and social ideals will be brought forward to supersede the Western liberal project, a time, if we can separate ourselves from the purveyors of despair, therefore of urgency and hope. The widespread sense that this is part one, an age of dissolution. The widespread sense that this is an age of collapsing identity is connected to the decline of Western global ascendancy. Long accustomed to regard its own formulations as universal because of its unchallenged power and monopoly over the project of modernization, its distinctive trajectories in Europe and in the United States have led to at least two specific assertions. In Europe, the arrogation stemming from its imperial status of the authority to direct a civilizing and modernizing function in country after country, and the broader American assertion that it was the ultimate model for post-colonial liberal societies, and therefore had a mission to instruct the world on modernization. When we tried to hire a South Asian political theorist in my department, my colleagues complained after his talk on South Asian political theory that he wasn't doing political theory but area studies. His response, an epiphany to me at the time, was, what was Machiavelli but a regional Italian thinker? And Locke, a theorist of English politics. Who decided they were universal? He did not get the job. Even as these claims are now tenuous, one encounters at times in the non-Western world the projects of identity formation heavily immersed in the very European and American narratives that reflect Western ascendancy, including, ironically, even their sense of pessimism reflecting the Western crises. The shift of initiative and innovation to other regions will hopefully continue to generate new discourses of identity formation. The dynamic is, in my view, different. The dynamic of vacuum is, in my view, different in Western Europe taken broadly and in the United States. The foundation of European identity was from the early modern period connected to its colonial and commercial ascendancy more than to a universalizing set of ideals as in the U.S. This is evident in the distinct effort of the European colonial powers to inculcate loyalty to their specific national cultures and institutions abroad. As that global power waned in the 20th century, and particularly after World War II, European culture descended into a self-pitying nihilism which dominated its philosophical and literary production. Brilliantly exposed in the cinema of Bernardo Bertolucci, the claim was that because the European narratives of identity were no longer viable, that no such narratives were henceforth possible. Consumed by an elegiac mood reminiscent of Shakespeare at the shattering of the traditional world, when Richard II laments, "Let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings," and by that he meant not just kings, but of kingship itself. So too, not simply European identities, but identity, authorship, subjectivity itself were to be no more. As Baudrillard wrote, identity is, quote, a dream that is pathetically absurd. You dream of being yourself when you have nothing better to do, when you have lost all singularity. There was then, amid this inconsolable mood, a lot of philosophical ruminating about the emergence of the other, and reflections about the nature of that other, but little encouragement for actual others to present themselves and their projects. The United States was in a distinct and ambiguous role. It had been both an other, which had struggled to speak in opposition to Europe, in forming its national identity, and at the same time it was shaped by the European, and particularly English imagination, as the embodiment of the universal phase of European ideals. These ideals were in origin the dissenting Protestant effort to replace the universal church, or Rome, with its own universal belief in personal conscience and popular religious fellowships, followed by the liberal and Enlightenment push for an active role for citizens in public institutions, civil relations, and personal life. As these were won in the 19th century on the path to American national consolidation and global power, the United States embraced the European aspiration that it proclaim itself the epitome of universalizing Western modernity in the 20th century, asserting the American century that was to be fortuitous for nations and peoples everywhere. Unlike the crisis of European identity, the American crisis began not with the eclipse of its ascendancy in the latter 20th century, but with its success as a modernizing nation. The challenge to its pattern of identity formed in the early modern period actually dates from its unparalleled preeminence in the 1960s. Americans approached the 1960s content with the competitive market society that over 150 years had propelled them to global ascendancy. To be sure, there was latent disquiet, a simmering spiritual discontent with growing privatism, materialism, organizational hierarchy, and conformity. But the complacency was only shattered with the counterculture challenge of the 1960s, which exposed these latent discontents. What was revealed was a society of empty ambitions, dehumanizing competition, and truncated identities, what psychologist Erich Fromm called the pseudo-world of the pseudo-self. The affluent society, many believed, no longer required a work-centered life, delayed and ultimately deferred gratification, stringent self-repression, and deference to institutional and cultural norms framed by majoritarian pressure and elite coercion. The self-sacrifice and compromise of life goals was no longer required given the immense productivity, promising an age of material security with untold opportunities for self-actualization, social connectedness, and political democracy. The ever more obvious discrepancy between traditional American values and a society increasingly oriented toward consumption, leisure, display, pleasure, and self-actualization radically undermined the public commitment to the classic psychic and moralist economy of American life. The possibility of a previously unimagined human flourishing stirred the hope of new identity formations. Yet little was offered to replace the culture of deprivation, fueling competition and acquisition. And in the end, Americans experienced the deep loss of moral and psychic orientation and a spreading sense of dislocation, depression, and paralysis that continues to this day.